They mocked the broken veteran for digging what looked like his own grave. But when the deadly floods came, that same dirt hole became the entire valley's only salvation. The Heroic Veteran Dogs is a fictional channel created to entertain, educate, and inspire the audience by exploring the deep, loyal bond between veterans and their dogs. All channel content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or documented cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is entirely coincidental. They laughed at the veteran with the shovel. For 3 months he dug into the Montana hillside like a man possessed, his German shepherd watching from the same patch of dirt. The town called him paranoid, broken, a soldier still fighting a war that ended long ago. His wife took everything when he came home wounded. His family stopped answering. All he had left was one patch of land, one loyal dog, and a hole in the earth no one believed in. Then the river rose, the crops drowned. The only dry food in the valley was buried behind a door they had all mocked. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. The first gray light of a Montana September crept across the ridge above Creek Bend Valley with the slow, patient indifference of something that had done this same thing 10,000 mornings before Jax Harlan was ever born and would do it 10,000 mornings after he was forgotten. It spread down the eastern face of the hillside in thin, bone-colored sheets, laying itself over the rust-spotted tin roof of the small cabin at the base of the slope, over the weathered gray planks of the porch, over the single bare bulb that still burned above the front door because Jax had not trusted the darkness enough last night to switch it off. He stood at the kitchen window with a chipped enamel mug wrapped in both hands, the coffee inside it so strong it smelled faintly of iron, and he watched the light come the way a man watches something he does not fully believe will arrive. His breath fogged the inside of the glass in a slow, uneven rhythm. The air coming through the gap at the bottom of the frame was cold enough to put a thin ache in the knuckles of his right hand, the hand that carried the old shrapnel scar from the knuckle of his index finger up to the base of his thumb in a pale, raised seam he had long ago stopped looking at. Behind him, on the braided rag rug that covered most of the kitchen's plank floor, Smokey lay in her customary half-curled posture, her head lifted, her amber eyes fixed on him. She had been awake for at least an hour, maybe longer, though she had made no sound. She rarely did. She listened to his body the way she had once listened to a command channel in an ear tucked inside a Kevlar vest, patient and absolute, and she moved only when his breathing told her to. The cabin had belonged to his Uncle Denton, a man Jax had met perhaps 4 times in his life and remembered mostly as a silhouette framed by the doorway of a canvas tent at a family reunion when Jax was 9. Denton had trapped the Big Belt Mountains for 40 years and died alone in a VA hospital in Helena with an unopened letter from Jax on the bedside table. A letter Jax had written from a forward operating base in Kandahar and never received a reply to. The lawyer's letter informing Jax of his inheritance had found him 11 months later in a motel outside Missoula, 2 weeks after his wife's attorney had finished dismantling what remained of his civilian life on paper. 12 acres, a cabin with a leaking roof, a collapsed barn, a creek that ran cold and clear at the bottom of the southern fence line, and a hillside behind the cabin that rose in a long, slow shoulder of grass and stone and scrub pine toward the ridge above. Denton had willed it all to Jax because Denton apparently had noticed something about the boy at a reunion 31 years ago that no one else in the Harlan family had bothered to remember. Jax had driven out to the county assessor's office the day after the letter arrived, signed what needed to be signed, and taken the keys with hands that had shaken for reasons he could not quite identify at the time. He had arrived at the property 14 months ago with one canvas duffel bag, one dog, one rifle in a soft case he had not opened since the discharge, and a sealed envelope from the Veterans Administration that he had stopped reading halfway through because the words inside seemed to belong to someone he no longer was. The keys had turned in the door on the first try, the floor inside had smelled of old smoke and cedar oil and the particular dust of a place that had waited a long time to be walked on again. Smokey had padded across the threshold first, the way she always did, moving with that careful, sweeping deliberation that was not fear but assessment, and had stopped at the center of the kitchen and looked at him as if to say, "This will do." He had slept on the floor for the first 9 nights. Not out of necessity. The bed frame in the back room was solid, and the mattress, though old, was dry. He had slept on the floor because the floor felt honest, it did not pretend. He had laid out his old military poncho liner and his canvas field jacket rolled as a pillow, and Smokey had taken up her position 2 feet from his head, and he had listened to the house settle around him in the deep Montana quiet and let something inside him unclench, one slow notch at a time. He sipped the coffee now. It had gone almost cold. He did not mind. The morning had that still, suspended quality he had come to trust, the kind of quiet that in his old life would have meant a clearing had been secured and the squad was waiting for the order to move. Out the window, the grass at the base of the hillside was silvered with dew that would not burn off for another hour. The air smelled of wood smoke from the stove behind him, of cold creek water, of the faint mineral tang of turned earth. He set the mug down on the counter beside the sink. The counter was warped along its forward edge where water had worked into the plywood at some point in the last decade, and a clean white dish towel lay folded across the bow. He had ironed that towel 2 nights ago, standing at the board he had set up in the corner, because the act of ironing was one of the small things a man could do to tell himself that he had not yet disappeared entirely. He picked up his work gloves from the hook beside the door. They were stiff with dried mud. He flexed them once, twice, until the fingers moved, and then he pulled them on. Smokey rose from the rug in a single fluid motion and waited at the door. The porch steps creaked under his boots. The east step had rotted through last spring, and he had replaced it himself, cutting the new plank from a piece of untreated cedar he had pulled from the collapsed barn. The new wood was still a paler shade than the others, and he had not yet gotten around to sealing it. He stepped over it out of habit, the way he had once stepped over certain tiles in an Iraqi courtyard because a sergeant in his first unit had told him never to trust a tile that did not match. The hillside rose ahead of him in the gray morning, and halfway up its face, set into the slope where the grade flattened into a natural shelf before rising again to the ridge, was the door. It was the door he had been building, in pieces and in stages, since the first week of June. It was framed in heavy cedar timbers he had milled himself from 2 fallen pines in the upper woodlot. Its panels were a layered construction of treated oak planks, a sheet of galvanized steel, a second layer of oak, all bolted together with carriage bolts he had driven through by hand because he did not own an impact driver and had not wanted to borrow one from the hardware store in town. The hinges were cast iron, forged by a blacksmith in Bozeman, who had done the work in exchange for Jack's clearing a month's worth of brush on the man's back lot. The door was set into the hillside at a slight angle, its top edge sheltered by a short roof of corrugated metal that he had anchored into the slope, with 4 feet of rebar driven at opposing angles. A man who knew what he was looking at would have known the door was built to last 100 years. A man who did not know would have seen only a hole in a hill with an ugly door over it. The town had seen only the hole. He climbed the footpath he had cut into the slope with a pickaxe in the second week of July. Smokey moved up beside him at her shoulder to his knee position, her paws nearly silent on the packed dirt, her head up, her ears turning in small, alert adjustments to catalog every sound in the morning. A raven called from the top of the ridge. She registered it and did not break stride. A pickup truck rattled somewhere on the county road more than a mile away. She registered that too. She moved the way she had always moved beside him, which was the way a second pair of eyes moves beside the first when both pairs have been trained by men with rifles in climates that did not forgive inattention. He reached the door, he set a gloved hand against its rough grain and pushed, and the hinges turned with a low, satisfying groan of well-greased iron. Beyond the door, stretching back into the hillside for 31 feet along a gently sloped corridor, was the cellar. The cold came out of it in a slow, patient exhale, smelling of earth and timber and the faint green-sweet tang of stored apples. He had dug the main chamber in July, working from 6 in the morning until the sun drove him into the shade at noon, then again from 4 until he could no longer see the blade of the shovel. He had reinforced the walls and ceiling with cedar beams cut from the same trees that had given him the door. He had laid the floor with river rock and crushed gravel, a slight grade toward a drainage channel at the back. He had built 3 tiers of shelving along each wall, a row of bins along the rear, and a low workbench where the shelving met the floor. He had installed a single oil lantern on a cast-iron hook at the entrance and a second deeper inside. He had painted nothing, he had varnished nothing. Everything inside that cellar was exactly what it was. He lit the entrance lantern now with a wooden match from the tin he kept in his jacket pocket. The flame leapt, caught the glass chimney, settled into the clean amber burn he preferred. He walked the length of the corridor slowly, the way he had always walked through any enclosed space, letting his eyes adjust one pace at a time. The shelves were full, on the left wall, stacked in their wooden crates with slatted sides that let the air move through them. Potatoes, 140 pounds of them, the yellow-fleshed kind his grandfather had favored, bedded in clean dry straw he had cut himself from the west pasture in early August. Beside the potatoes in a second run of crates, the carrots, their greens trimmed to a half-inch stub, laid horizontally in layers of damp sand to keep them firm through the winter. Beyond the carrots, the onions, braided by their own tops into long, fragrant ropes that hung from a cedar beam he had set specifically for them. On the right wall, the canning. He had never canned a jar of anything in his life before this summer. He had bought a used water bath canner at a yard sale in Great Falls for $7. He had taught himself from a book his grandmother had owned in 1948 and which he had found at the bottom of a box in the cabin's back room, and he had worked through it one recipe at a time. Tomatoes in clear glass quart jars, the liquid inside them a slow, deep red that caught the lantern light like stained glass. Green beans, pickled beets, apple sauce from the 5 wild apple trees along the creek that no one had tended in 30 years and that still produced every September like they had been promised to. Strawberry jam from the patch behind the cabin. Peach preserves from a case of fruit he had driven 200 miles to buy from a Hutterite colony outside Lewistown. At the back, in oak barrels he had cleaned and relined with food-grade wax, the root vegetables meant for deep storage. Cabbages wrapped individually in newspaper, rutabagas, turnips, winter squash laid in single layers on straw-padded shelves, a burlap sack of walnuts, another of pecans, a row of mason jars holding dried apples, dried plums, dried mushrooms from the morel flush he had caught in May on the north slope. It was enough to feed 1 man and 1 dog for 2 winters, and more. He walked back to the entrance and stood a moment looking out at the hillside and the valley beyond. From here, in the cool shadow of the cellar mouth, he could see the southern edge of his land, the line of cottonwoods that marked the creek, and beyond the creek, the long, gentle stretch of bottomland, where the other farms of Creekbend Valley lay spread out in a patchwork of hayfields and pastures and cultivated plots. A thin, white mist was rising off the creek. The sky beyond the ridge was the color of a gun barrel. He thought, without letting himself think it fully, that the mist was wrong for this time of year. The air was too heavy. The crows on the fence line were too quiet. He had noticed these things over the last 3 days and had said nothing about them to anyone because there was no one to say them to and because he had long ago stopped trusting his own instincts to mean anything in a civilian world. Smokey pressed her shoulder lightly against his left thigh. He looked down. She was looking at the valley. Her ears were up and forward. Her nostrils flared once, slowly. She looked up at him. He held her gaze. "I know," he said very quietly. She thumped her tail once against the packed dirt of the cellar floor. He closed the cellar door behind them and slid the iron bar into its bracket. He walked back down the path to the cabin with the dog at his knee, and he did not look at the sky again, because a man did not need to look twice at the same warning. At the kitchen table he sat down across from the window and poured himself the last of the coffee from the stovetop pot. The cabin was quiet around him in the way it was always quiet, which was a quiet that held the memory of another man's life inside it. The cedar and smoke and the half-erased pencil marks on the doorframe that marked the heights of Denton's dogs over the years. Smokey lay at his feet. Her head rested across the tongue of his left boot. Her particular and favorite station, the place where she had lain every morning for 1,411 mornings if he had counted, which he had not, and had also somehow always known the number of. The memory came the way it always came, without warning, triggered by something small and stupid. The smell of gun oil from the tin he had used last night to oil the hinges of the cellar door. That was all it took. The smell rose from his jacket cuff, and he was back, for a half-second, in the low light of a vehicle bay in Kandahar province, his hands on the bolt of a carbine, a voice beside him saying something he could not quite hear, and the light of a single bare bulb overhead flickering in a way that meant the generator was cycling. He blinked. He set the mug down with a small, controlled motion. Smokey's head had lifted off his boot. She had not moved otherwise. Her eyes were fixed on his face, and her ears were half back, and he watched the fine intelligence of her read him, read the room, read the nothing, that was happening, and he watched her decide it was only a flicker and not a flood. Her head lowered slowly back to his boot. "I'm here," he said to her. Her tail thumped once against the floor. He breathed out through his nose, long and slow, the way he had been taught in a VA clinic in Billings by a counselor who had meant well and who had not understood at any level what it was she was asking him to do, but whose simple instruction had over time become a thing his body did on its own. 4 counts in through the nose, 7 counts holding, 8 counts out through the mouth. He did it 3 times, his hands steadied around the mug. He thought about his wife sometimes. He did not think about her now. He thought about the shape of the land beyond the window, and the work that still needed to be done before winter, and the 50 pounds of oats he had ordered from the feed store in town that Carl Hensley had forgotten to put on the truck last Friday and had promised to deliver this Friday, today, which meant a trip into Creek Bend before the rain came. He washed the mug in cold water and set it upside down on the towel. He took his field jacket off the hook by the door and shrugged it onto his shoulders and pulled the collar up around his neck. And he clipped the lead he almost never used onto Smokey's collar because the town required it and because he did not pick fights with things that did not matter. He opened the door. The morning air was colder than it had been an hour ago. The wind had picked up half a notch from the west. He registered it without naming it. "Let's go," he said. She walked at his knee to the truck. The truck was a 1989 Ford F250, 3/4-ton, inline 6, 240,000 miles on the odometer, the bed dented and the rocker panels starting to go, but the engine as honest as any machine he had ever known. He opened the passenger door, and Smokey hopped up onto the bench seat and sat, her ears up, her tail across the cracked vinyl. He closed the door, walked around the front and got in. The starter caught on the second turn. He let it warm. The drive to Creek Bend took 17 minutes on the gravel county road, past the Henderson place, past the old Tolliver barn that had been sagging toward the ground for a decade, past the bend in the creek where the road narrowed between 2 granite outcroppings, past the sign that read "Welcome to Creek Bend Pop 812 EST 1889" in letters weathered almost to the color of the wood behind them. The town itself was 4 streets wide and 6 streets long and consisted of a gas station, a feed store, a diner, a post office, a small brick library, a Methodist church, a Lutheran church, 2 bars, and the general store that Carl Hensley had inherited from his father in 1994 and run in the same slow, self-important way ever since. Jax parked the truck in the gravel lot beside Hensley's. He rolled the window down 2 inches for the dog and stepped out. The bell above the glass door jangled when he pushed it open. The interior of the store was warm and smelled of coffee and cardboard and the faint, sweet chemical smell of the pesticide aisle at the back. 4 men were gathered around the small wood stove by the cash register, which Carl liked to keep burning from the first week of September through the last week of May because the warmth brought people in and kept them standing around long enough to buy things they had not come in for. Carl himself stood behind the register, his belly against the counter, his hands resting on a newspaper folded open to the sports page. The conversation stopped when Jax walked in. It always did. It did not always stop completely, but there was always a drop, a half-second pause, a small adjustment in the tone and volume of whatever was being said, a lifting of 4 or 5 pairs of eyes to track him across the room. He had long ago learned not to notice it in any way that could be seen from the outside. Inside him, it was noticed. "Morning, Jax," Carl said, in the voice that was not unfriendly, but was not friendly either. The voice of a man reading a script he had written for himself. "Morning," Jax said. "Here for your oats." "Yes." "On the loading dock. Bill's already cut. $57.80. Jax took his wallet from the inside pocket of his jacket, counted out 320s, laid them on the counter. Carl made change slow. Behind him, one of the men at the stove, a rancher named Earl Paxton, whose family had been on the same 700 acres west of town since 1903, spoke in a voice pitched low enough to carry only to the other men at the stove, which meant it was pitched exactly low enough to carry to Jax as well. "You hear what Hollow Jax is up to out there now?" Earl said. "Hensley says he's got half the hardware store's cedar in his barn. Man's digging himself a bunker for the end of the world." A low chuckle around the stove. One of the men coughed to cover it. Carl kept counting change with studied concentration. "Maybe he knows something we don't," a younger voice said. It was Ben Olison, Tom Olison's boy, not yet 30, who worked at the propane yard. There was less mockery in his voice than in Earl's. There was something closer to curiosity. Jax did not turn toward him. "What he knows," Earl said, "is how to throw his disability check at a hole in a hill. Man's got his crazy wrapped up in a cedar bow. I'd call it a hobby if it weren't so sad." Jax picked up his change. He folded the bills and put them in his wallet. He put the wallet in his jacket. He did not look at Earl. He did not look at Carl. He said, "Thanks, Carl," and he walked back across the store and out the door. The bell jangled behind him. He did not hear what they said after it jangled. He did not need to. He had heard variations of it every week for 11 months, at the hardware store, at the gas station, at the post office. He had never once answered any of it. He had understood from the first week that any word he offered in defense of himself would be a word the town would chew on like a piece of fat for months, and he had been trained by a decade and a half of service not to give an enemy ammunition. He had stopped thinking of them as an enemy a long time ago. He had started thinking of them as weather. He loaded the oats onto the truck bed. Smokey watched through the glass. He got back in, started the engine, and turned toward home. In the rear-view mirror, he saw Ben Olison standing on the store's porch, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the truck pull away. Ben did not wave. He did not turn back inside. He just stood there. Jax drove home through the sharpening wind. The sky to the west had gone from gun-barrel gray to something darker. Smokey sat straight on the seat with her nose almost touching the windshield, her breath misting the glass in a soft, regular rhythm. He reached over with his right hand, the scarred one, and rested it on the ridge of her shoulder. She leaned into it, once, firmly, and then settled. "I know," he said to her again. "I know, girl." He drove the rest of the way in silence, and when he pulled up to the cabin, the first drops of the rain that would not stop for 4 days had begun to darken the boards of the porch. The rain began as a whisper against the tin roof of the cabin, a sound so soft at first that a man who had not spent years listening for things that did not yet want to be heard would have missed it entirely. It came down in fine, slanting lines against the porch boards, dark spotting the cedar one drop at a time, releasing that dense green smell of wet grass and pine resin and turned earth that only a Montana September could produce. Jax stood under the porch overhang with the truck's tailgate down behind him. The 50-pound sacks of oats already carried through the front door and stacked in the feed room off the back kitchen. His hands flat against the small of his back as he straightened slowly to work the stiffness out of the old lumbar injury he never mentioned to anyone. He watched the rain a long time before he moved. The sky above the ridge had darkened to a shade of slate that seemed to hold no weather in it at all, only a kind of patient weight, and the wind that had been rising all morning now came down from the west in slow, thick gusts that pressed against the tall grass at the base of the hillside and bent it in long, rippling lines. Smokey stood a pace behind him, inside the doorway, her ears forward, her nose working the air. Every few seconds her head tilted a quarter-inch to the north. She was listening to the creek. He had met Elena Marquez for the first time at the Creek Bend Farmers Market 6 weeks after she had moved into the Dahlgren place. The Dahlgren place was a 4-acre plot on the eastern shoulder of the valley, a white clapboard farmhouse with a green tin roof and a sagging barn and a quarter-acre of old variety apple trees that had not been pruned properly in at least 2 decades. Old Pete Dahlgren had died the previous winter at the age of 91, and his children, none of whom lived closer than Seattle, had put the property on the market for a price so low it had been quietly understood in town that they were embarrassed by the asking number and simply wanted the thing sold. A young woman from Albuquerque had bought it in the spring. This had been the subject of Carl Hensley's front-counter commentary for approximately 2 weeks, after which the town had moved on to other subjects. Jax had not formed an opinion about her. He had not formed an opinion about anyone in Creek Bend in 14 months, except the private, professional read of each one's weight and reach that his training had laid down in him like a second layer of skin, and that read was not opinion but only catalog. He had registered a small, dark-haired woman in her late 20s, perhaps 5'3", 115 pounds, wearing a canvas jacket and work boots and an expression that did not ask for anything, moving efficiently through the aisles of the store with a small boy, holding onto the hem of her jacket with one hand. The boy had been the thing he noticed. The boy had been maybe 7 years old, small for his age, dark-haired like his mother, with large, still brown eyes that moved across the store in the deliberate, measured way of a child who had learned early that the world was not always a safe place. He had worn a dark blue hooded sweatshirt and jeans and scuffed sneakers, and, around his neck, partially tucked into the collar of the sweatshirt, a short beaded chain of the kind a soldier wore, and on that chain, barely visible under the fabric, the dull gray glint of two flat metal tags. Jax had seen the chain. He had not reacted to it in any way that could be seen. Inside him, some old muscle had flexed once and released. He had passed them in the aisle between the flour and the pet food. He had nodded to her in the small, wordless greeting that passed between adults in a town where most adults knew each other's business. She had nodded back. Her eyes had not lingered. The boy had looked up at Jax and then at Smokey at his knee, and his expression had changed, not dramatically, but in the soft, unmistakable way a child's face changes when he sees a dog he wants very badly to touch and knows he must not ask. Jax had stopped. He had said, quietly, "You can pet her if you like. She's gentle." The boy had looked at his mother. His mother had looked at the dog, then at Jax, then at the dog again, and she had nodded once. The boy had knelt, slowly, and put his small hand against the thick ruff at the side of Smokey's neck, and Smokey had lowered her head a fraction of an inch and stood utterly still. The boy had not smiled. He had closed his eyes briefly, the way a person closes their eyes at the first sip of something they have not had in a long time. "Thank you," the mother had said. Her voice had been soft and steady. There had been no accent in it that he could place, nothing that marked her out, except the careful, even tone of a woman who had learned to measure every word she said in public. "No trouble," Jax had said. The boy had stood. They had moved on. That had been the first time. He had seen her 3 times since then, always at a distance. Once at the farmer's market, selling herbs and early peppers from a folding table covered in a blue cloth. Once at the post office, picking up a package. Once on the county road, driving a gray Toyota pickup with a bed full of firewood she had cut herself, based on the way the logs were stacked, which was the way a person stacked them when they did not want to do the work twice. He had noted her. He had not approached. The boy had been with her every time. The boy had worn the chain every time. Carl Hensley had told anyone who would listen that the young widow from New Mexico was a fool for buying the Dahlgren place because the roof on that farmhouse was going to go in the first hard winter, and that girl did not have the money or the know-how to fix it. And Jax had listened to this commentary from a distance of 6 feet across a counter, and had said nothing, and had thought, for one flat and dispassionate second, about the roof of his own cabin, which he had patched himself in the 3rd week of his ownership with a roll of roofing felt, a bucket of tar, and a day of work he had not billed anyone for. Now, standing on his own porch in the sharpening rain, watching the creek bottom turn slowly from green to dark olive as the water rose inside the grass, he thought about the Dahlgren place and the tin roof, and the young woman with the careful eyes. And he did not know yet that he was thinking about any of it for a reason. The rain picked up around 1 in the afternoon. He spent the next 3 hours doing what his grandfather had taught him, without ever once using the words his grandfather had used. He checked the gutters. He cleared the drainage channel at the back of the cellar. He moved the generator from the porch to the small weatherproof shed he had built for it against the west wall of the cabin. He topped off its tank from the red plastic can in the truck bed, and tested the starter twice, and listened to the engine come alive and die back down, and thought, "This will hold for at least 4 days without refueling." He stacked an extra cord of split wood on the inside porch, under the overhang where the rain could not reach it. He checked the batteries in 3 flashlights and the hand-crank emergency radio he had bought at a yard sale in Great Falls for $4. He brought 2 full 5-gallon water jugs up from the truck and set them inside the kitchen beside the stove. Smokey followed him through all of it, her paws silent on the wet grass, her coat darkening in the rain, her body tracking his position without ever once appearing to track it. Once, near the cellar door, she stopped and looked east toward the creek and lowered her head and made a sound he had not heard her make in a long time. Not a bark, not a growl, a low, short exhalation through her nose. Something between a sigh and a warning. He had looked at her. "Yeah," he had said. "I know, girl." At 4 in the afternoon, he turned on the radio. The Weather Service broadcast came through the speaker in the calm, formal voice of a man reading a document written by a machine. A flood watch had been issued for the Yellowstone Basin and the Missouri headwaters, A stationary front had settled over the northern Rockies. Rainfall amounts of 3 to 6 inches were expected in the next 72 hours, with locally higher totals in the foothills. Small streams and creeks were likely to exceed bankfull. Residents in low-lying areas along the Musselshell, the Judith, and tributary drainages were advised to remain alert to rising water and to prepare emergency supplies. He turned the radio off. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded, and he thought about the valley. Creekbend Valley was a long, narrow bowl of bottomland that sloped south from the foothills down toward the main stem of the Musselshell. The creek that gave the town its name ran down the center of the valley in a meandering course that had been straightened in places by the Army Corps back in the 40s and then, for the most part, left alone. When the creek stayed in its banks, the bottomland was some of the richest farm ground in central Montana. Black loam, 3 feet deep, drained and drained again by the old ditch systems the settlers had cut 120 years ago. When the creek did not stay in its banks, which had happened, according to what Jax had picked up in careful listening, in 1964 and again in 1978, and once more, less dramatically, in 1997, the bottomland turned into a shallow lake for a week or two, and then emerged green and silt-covered and ready for planting again by May. But a flood in September, with crops still standing in the fields and the town unprepared, was a different animal than a flood in April. He thought about the Dahlgren place. It sat on the eastern shoulder of the valley, on a slight rise, perhaps 6 feet above the grade of the creek at the bottomland crossing. 6 feet was nothing. 6 feet was what the creek had taken in '64. The Dahlgren farmhouse had been built in 1912 by a man who knew what he was doing, and it had stood through both of the big floods, but the barn had gone in '64 and been rebuilt. And the new barn was the one that was sagging now, and the plot around it was flat and open and low. He did not know her phone number. He did not know if she had neighbors close enough to help her. He did not know if anyone in town had thought to drive out and warn her, and he suspected, with a weight in his chest that he did not examine too closely, that no one had. Smokey was lying on the rag rug by the stove, her head on her front paws, her eyes open and fixed on him, her ears turned toward the window every few seconds. The rain against the glass had hardened from the afternoon's steady patter into a heavier, more insistent drum. He could hear the creek now, or thought he could, a deeper undertone beneath the rain. The first low voice of water that was starting to move with force. He stood up. He went to the drawer beside the stove and took out the heavy-duty flashlight and the handheld VHF radio he kept there. He checked the batteries on both. He pulled his rain slicker off the hook by the door, the old yellow one with the ripped left cuff that he had patched with gaffer tape, and he put it on over his field jacket. Smokey was already on her feet. "We're going to take a drive," he said to her quietly. "Just a drive." She went to the door. He did not make the drive in the end, not that afternoon. He stepped out onto the porch and looked at the road down to the county route, and the road was already a slurry of running mud, and the visibility was down to maybe 100 feet through the rain, and he made the soldier's calculation that had kept him alive in other weather, in other places. The risk of the drive outweighed the certainty of the information. The Dahlgren place was 2 miles away by the county road. He would not make it there in this visibility without putting himself and his truck in the ditch, and if he went in the ditch, he would be no use to anyone. He stood on the porch and watched the rain for a long moment, and he said to no one, to himself, to Smokey, to the memory of a grandfather who had taught him never to go into weather he did not have to be in. "Tomorrow, first light." Smokey thumped her tail once, slowly, against the porch board. He went back inside. He banked the stove. He laid out a change of dry clothes on the chair beside the bed, the way he had learned to lay out a change of clothes in any bunk, anywhere. The possibility of a night call-out existed. He checked the flashlight by the bed. He checked the boots by the door. He sat in the chair by the stove with a book he had been working his way through for the past month, a battered library copy of a history of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and he read 3 pages without absorbing any of them, and he listened to the rain against the roof grow steadily heavier until sometime around 9 in the evening, when the first crack of distant thunder rolled down the valley from the west. Smokey lifted her head at the thunder. She did not look at the window. She did not look at the door. She looked at him. Her amber eyes caught the lantern light and held it. She did not whine. She did not shift. She just looked at him, steady and ancient and knowing, and he looked back, And he knew, the way a man sometimes knows things without being able to say how he knew them, that something was coming that was going to require everything he had and more. He got up. He walked to the window. The yard was a sheet of moving water in the lantern glow. The grass was already flattened. The creek, down at the bottom of the property, was a dark roar he could hear now even through the walls. "Tomorrow," he said again, more to himself than to the dog. First light. He turned off the lantern. The rain pressed down on the tin roof in a long, unbroken hammer. He lay down on the bed in his clothes, his boots by the floor within reach, his jacket folded across the foot of the bed, and Smokey took her position on the rug beside him, her body angled toward the door. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep. He was awake, fully and completely awake, at 4:17 in the morning, when the sound of the creek changed. A creek that had been running hard but within itself had, in the space of perhaps 3 minutes, shifted into a deeper, rougher, wider sound, a bass rumble that carried through the floor of the cabin into the frame of the bed, and through the soles of his boots and up into the bones of his feet. He had felt it before he had heard it. He sat up in the darkness without any transition from sleep, which was the way his body had learned to sit up in a decade and a half of service, and Smokey was already on her feet beside the bed, her ears forward, her body angled toward the door, her weight distributed exactly the way it was distributed in the half-second before she moved in any direction. He stood. He reached for the lantern on the bedside crate, and turned the wick up and put the match to it. The amber light caught the inside of the cabin in its slow, warm wash, and he saw his breath in the air. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees in the night. He pulled on his field jacket. He pulled on his rain slicker over that. He laced the boots tight. He checked the flashlight. He took the VHF from the drawer. He went to the door. Smokey was already there, her body low, her eyes on the gap at the bottom of the door, where the wind was pushing under the threshold. "With me," he said. They stepped out onto the porch. The world outside was not a world he recognized. The yard had become a shallow river. Water was moving across the grass in visible glinting sheets, 6 inches deep against the porch steps running from east to west, which meant the creek had breached its banks somewhere upstream, and the water was finding its way across the low ground in a wash that would only deepen. The rain was coming down in hard, slanting lines that caught the lantern light in long silver streaks. The air smelled of turned silt and wet cedar and something else, something mineral and sour. The smell of a river that had picked up topsoil and silage and was starting to carry them. He could not see the creek from the porch. He could only hear it. It was no longer a creek. It was something else now. He went back inside. He moved fast and without wasted motion. He stuffed a canvas bag with supplies. The second flashlight, a coil of 3/8 rope, a folding knife, the handheld VHF, a wool blanket, a flask of water, a roll of gauze and a field dressing kit he had carried through 3 deployments and had never once needed to use on himself. He pulled on a ball cap under the slicker's hood to keep the rain out of his eyes. He grabbed the truck keys from the hook. He did not bring the rifle. He thought about it. He decided against it. He did not know what he was going to find, and he did not know who he was going to find it with. And the last thing he wanted to do in a crisis was give the civilian world one more reason to be afraid of him. Smokey jumped into the passenger seat the instant he opened the door. He climbed in. The engine caught on the first turn. He gave it 30 seconds to warm, which was not enough, and he did not care. He put the transmission in 4-wheel low. He eased the truck forward. The access road was gone. There was no road. Only the memory of where the road had been. A channel of moving water 2 feet deep running down the cut where the gravel used to be. He kept the truck to the high side, 2 wheels on the grass shoulder, 2 wheels in the water, and he took it at 8 miles an hour, because the question in a flood was not speed but traction, and the wrong touch of the throttle was the difference between a truck that made it through and a truck that became part of the water. He reached the county road at 4:36. The county road was still there, for now. It ran along the slope of the valley's eastern side, and water was sheeting across it in places, but the asphalt had not yet given way. He turned south. The Dahlgren place was 2 miles down, on the right at the bottom of the slope where the road dipped toward the creek crossing. He had driven half a mile when he saw the first of the damage. The old Tolliver barn had collapsed in the night, not from water, from wind. The sagging structure had finally taken one gust too many, and it lay now in a slumped heap of gray boards across the fence line, the tin roof torn into sections and folded over like paper. He slowed He checked for livestock. There were no Tollivers on the property any longer, but he checked anyway because a man checked. Nothing. He drove on. At the bend in the road by the granite outcroppings, he had to stop. A cottonwood had come down across both lanes. Its trunk snapped off 10 feet up, its upper branches dragging in the wash. He could not move it alone. He backed the truck up 200 feet, put it in 4 low, and drove through the ditch and up onto the adjacent pasture, bumping and sliding across the muddy grass until he was past the tree, and then back down onto the road. The tires spun once, caught, carried him through. Smokey sat with her front paws braced against the dashboard, her body compensating for every lurch, and she made no sound. He crested the small rise before the Dahlgren place, and he saw what the creek had done. Below him, in the pre-dawn gray, the valley bottom was not farmland anymore. It was a lake, a slow, wide slate-gray lake, 3 feet deep or more in places, stretching from the eastern slope to the western slope, dotted with the black tops of fence posts and the dark emerging shapes of submerged equipment and the occasional eerie half-island of a hayfield that had sat high enough to still show. The creek, where the creek was supposed to be, was a white seam of fast water running down the middle of the lake. The bottomland was gone, the corn was gone, the oat fields were gone, the pumpkin patch that the Olsons had been tending for 2 generations was gone, the pastures were gone, the cattle, where there were cattle he could not see. The Dahlgren farmhouse stood in the middle of the lake like a small white ship. The water had come up around its foundation. The front porch was underwater. The barn, the sagging barn, had gone. He could see it, or pieces of it, tangled in the debris line that had formed against the remains of a fence 200 feet downstream. The main house, 2 stories, tin roof, held. He could see movement on the roof. He picked up the VHF and keyed it. Creek Bend Sheriff. This is Jax Harlan on the East Valley Road. Creek is breached. Dahlgren place is flooded. I have visual on people on the roof. Copy. Static. He waited 5 seconds. He keyed again. Creek Bend, this is Harlan. Do you copy? Static. He tried a 3rd time and got the same answer, and understood that the VHF repeater on Baldy Ridge had either lost power or been knocked out by the storm, and that the sheriff and every other emergency service in the county were at this moment aware of exactly nothing that was happening in Creek Bend Valley. He put the radio back in the bag. He drove the truck down the slope to where the water began and stopped. The water was moving, not fast here, on the edge, but moving. He got out. He stood at the tailgate and looked at the farmhouse across what used to be the Dahlgren pasture. It was perhaps 200 yards away. The water between him and the house looked shallow, knee-deep on the high points, waist-deep in the lower spots. The current, he estimated, was 3 to 4 miles an hour, passable, cold, dangerous. He opened the toolbox in the truck bed and took out the coil of heavy nylon rope, 40 feet of it, 3/4 inch. He tied one end to the steel bumper hitch. He looped the other end around his waist with a bowline. He took the canvas bag and slung it over his shoulder. He looked at Smokey, who was standing on the driver's seat now, her body rigid, her eyes on him. Stay, he said. Truck, stay. She looked at him with her whole being and did not move. Stay, he said again. I'll be back. He pushed the door to, leaving it unlatched so she could get out if she needed to, and he turned and walked into the water. The cold hit him like a blow to the chest. It was the cold of a creek that had drained a mountain 2 days before and carried that mountain's memory in it. And it went through the rain slicker and the field jacket and the shirt and the long underwear in under 3 seconds. He kept walking. The mud under his boots was a deep, slick clay that pulled at his heels. The current came against his right side in a steady, even push. He kept his weight forward and his stance wide, and he walked. At 50 yards the water was at his waist. At 100 yards it dropped to his thighs. At 150 yards, as he approached the higher ground around the farmhouse, it was back to his knees. The rope paid out behind him. The bag on his shoulder was soaked through within 30 seconds, but the field dressing kit was in a waterproof pouch inside the bag, and the flashlight was sealed and the knife was on his belt. And he thought methodically what he had. He reached the porch steps. The porch itself was under 18 inches of water. He climbed up onto the porch and looked up at the roofline. "Hello," he called. Not loud. Loud enough to carry. "I'm here to help." A face appeared at the edge of the roof, up near the chimney. Elena Marquez. Her hair was wet and plastered to her skull. She was wearing a dark coat over what looked like a pajama shirt. Her eyes were huge. She did not scream. She did not cry. She held herself like a person who had already done both, and was now in the part that came after. "There's two of us," she said. Her voice carried thin through the rain. "My son is with me. Can you climb down to the porch roof?" "Yes." "Do it. Slowly. I'm coming up." He looked at the trellis at the corner of the porch, an old wooden thing gone gray with age. He tested it with his weight. It held. He climbed. He was on the porch roof in 20 seconds. He extended a hand down to where she was crouched at the edge of the upper roof, and he said, "Put the boy in my arms first." She did. She lowered Mateo down over the edge, one hand under each of the boy's arms, and Jax took him. The boy was shaking so hard that Jax could feel the vibration of it through his rain slicker and through his jacket and into his chest. The boy was wrapped in a blanket that was soaked through but tucked tight around his small body. The boy did not make a sound. His eyes were open and fixed on Jax's face, and Jax saw in those eyes the specific, silent kind of terror he had seen in children in 3 different countries. The kind that does not scream because screaming has been learned not to help. "You're all right," Jax said to the boy, quietly. "You're all right, son. I've got you." Mateo did not speak. His small hand came up and closed on the collar of Jax's slicker with a grip that would not come off easily. Elena came down the trellis after. She moved well. She did not freeze. At the bottom she sat on the porch roof and slid her legs over the edge and let herself down onto the porch itself, where the water was now up to her thighs. "Anything inside we need?" Jax asked. "No." "Documents. Medicine." I grabbed a waterproof pouch in my jacket. "That's everything." "All right, we're going back across. I've got a rope tied to my truck. Hold on to the rope with one hand and to me with the other. The boy goes on my shoulders. He can't swim." "He doesn't need to. I'm carrying him." She looked at him. In the dim gray of the pre-dawn, in the middle of a farm that had just become a lake, with her life savings underwater and her house about to be gutted, she looked at him with the exact, unblinking assessment of a person who had learned a long time ago how to judge a stranger in a crisis, and she nodded, once, and said, "All right." He put Mateo up on his shoulders. The boy wrapped his small legs around Jax's neck and his small arms around Jax's head and held on. Elena took the rope in her right hand and put her left hand on the sleeve of Jax's field jacket, gripping the fabric at his elbow. They stepped off the porch into the water. The crossing back took 11 minutes. Jax counted every one of them. He kept his stance wide. He kept his eyes on the truck. He felt Elena's hand shake against his sleeve once, and he felt it steady again in the same breath, and he felt the boy's small, sharp heels tapping a nervous, involuntary rhythm against his collarbones. The current pushed. He moved against it. The rope paid back onto the bank behind them in long, snaking lines. At the halfway point, Smokey barked once from the truck. It was the first sound he had heard her make since he had entered the water. It was a sound of greeting, not of warning, a single sharp syllable that said, "I see you, I am here." Jax kept walking. They climbed out on the shoulder of the county road at 4:59. The truck's headlights were still on. Smokey was standing in the driver's seat, with her front paws on the windowsill, her ears forward, her whole body trembling with a tension she had been holding for the entire time he had been in the water. He opened the passenger door and lifted Mateo off his shoulders and set him on the seat. The boy did not let go of his slicker. The boy's grip on the collar had tightened, rather than loosened. Jax gently unfastened the small fingers one at a time. Smokey was watching the boy. She did not lick him. She did not move to him. She lay down slowly across the center of the bench seat, her body between the driver's side and the boy, her head turned so that she could see him, and she stayed there. Elena climbed in after. Jax shut the door. He walked around to the driver's side, got in, put the heater on high, and said quietly, "There's a blanket behind the seat. Wrap him up." Elena found the blanket. She wrapped the boy. She wrapped herself in the corner of it. The heater fan was loud in the cab. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm. The rain kept coming. "I'm taking you to my place," Jax said. "It's dry, it's warm, it's not fancy. You'll be safe there until the sheriff can get out here." "Thank you," Elena said. Her voice was very soft. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when the water goes down." He put the truck in gear. He drove back up the road toward the cabin, past the fallen cottonwood, past the collapsed Tolliver barn, through the running water where the gravel used to be. Smokey did not take her eyes off the boy for the entire drive. The boy did not speak. Elena sat very straight with her hands folded in her lap, watching the road through the windshield, and Jax watched her in the small glances he allowed himself between checks of the road, and he thought, in a distant and detached part of his mind, that he had seen that posture before, on other faces, in other vehicles, after other disasters, and that it was the posture of a person who was doing the mathematics of what they had just lost, and who had not yet permitted herself to cry. At the cabin he opened the door and led them in. The stove was still warm. He added wood. He set water on for tea, because tea was what his grandmother had always made in a crisis, and because hot liquid in a person's hands was a thing that helped more than most medicines. He gave Elena a stack of his own dry clothes from the dresser, a flannel shirt, a pair of sweatpants, a pair of wool socks, and pointed her to the bathroom. He took the boy to the kitchen chair by the stove and crouched in front of him. "Can you get out of those wet things, son?" The boy nodded, but did not move. Jax waited. After a moment the boy lifted his arms and let Jax pull the wet sweatshirt off over his head. Under the sweatshirt, on its beaded chain, lay the dog tags. Jax saw them. He did not look at them. He did not read them. A part of him registered them and put the registering aside, because the boy was shivering and needed dry clothes and a warm cup and a human being to sit beside him, and the registering would wait. It waited. He found a small flannel shirt of his own that he rolled the sleeves up on 3 times and put it on the boy, and a pair of his own wool socks that came up past the boy's knees, and he wrapped the boy in the blanket again and set him in the chair nearest the stove, and Smokey, who had followed them in, lay down at the boy's feet with her head across the toe of his wool sock. The boy looked down at her. The boy did not smile, the boy did not speak, but the shaking eased, 1 degree, then another. Jax stood. He turned toward the stove. He put his hands on the warm iron top of it and let the heat come up into his palms and through his wrists and into his forearms. Outside, the rain kept coming. In the next room, he could hear Elena pulling the bathroom door closed. He could hear the water run. He did not turn. He kept his hands on the stove. He kept his eyes on the small figure in the chair and on the dog at the small figure's feet. In the back of his mind, a word was sitting that he had not yet allowed himself to read, a word on a piece of stamped aluminum hanging from a beaded chain. He would read it later. He would read it when it was time, for now there was work to do. By 7 in the morning the rain had not lessened by a single measurable amount, and the first knock at the cabin door came hard and fast and 3 times in succession, the way a man knocks when he has run the last 200 yards to your porch. Jax opened it. Ben Olison stood on the boards in a soaked canvas coat, his hair plastered flat, water running off the brim of his ball cap in a steady stream. His father's old Dodge was parked in the yard behind him, with the engine still running, and in the passenger seat Jax could see an older woman, gray-haired, wrapped in a quilt, her head leaned back against the headrest. "My mother," Ben said. His voice was breathless. "The creek took our basement. The hole downstairs is under. She can't walk far, is there? Can we bring her in? The propane yard is gone. 4 tanks came off the pad. Bring her in, Ben. Put the truck under the porch overhang where it's dry. Come inside." They came inside. Jax helped the older woman out of the truck and into the cabin, one arm under her elbow, her slippered feet careful on the wet boards. Ben followed with a small suitcase. Mrs. Olison had not wept. She was beyond weeping, in the way of women who had lost things in other decades, and had learned what weeping did and did not do. Elena stood in the kitchen in Jax's oversized flannel, her hair still wet, and she stepped forward without being asked and took the older woman's free arm on the other side, and the 2 of them eased her into the second chair by the stove. Elena knelt and unlaced the wet slippers from the older woman's feet and replaced them with a pair of dry wool socks from the pile Jax had left on the kitchen table. The older woman looked down at Elena and said softly, "Thank you, dear." And Elena nodded without meeting her eyes, because meeting her eyes would have broken something Elena could not yet afford to break. By 9 in the morning, there were 7 people in Jax's cabin. By 11, there were 11. By 1 in the afternoon, there were 17. And the cabin was a room full of wet coats, steaming on chairbacks, and wool blankets draped over shoulders, and children sitting on the floor near the stove, and adults standing against the walls, because there was no more room for them to sit. The Hansons, the Petersons and their 3 boys, a rancher named Caleb Turner, who had walked 2 miles through the water from the western slope to get there. The Vance sisters, two widowed women in their 70s who lived together in the old schoolhouse at the bottom of the valley, both of them sat in blankets in the corner by the window, holding each other's hands, watching the rain. A Hutterite family who had been caught on the wrong side of the creek while delivering eggs to Creekbend at 5 in the morning. The father, the mother, 4 small children. A young couple, Jacks, did not recognize who said they had been camping at the state park and their car had been swept. They came because there was nowhere else to come. The sheriff's radio was down. The county road was cut in 3 places. The bridge over the main stem of the Musselshell at Roundup was reported by the one short-range radio transmission anyone had received as under 4 feet of water and impassable. FEMA had issued a statement, someone said, who had heard it on a phone before the cell tower went, that response teams would be inbound by late afternoon. Late afternoon came and went, the teams did not come. The rain did not stop. Jacks managed it the way a man manages any crisis he has been trained for, which was by doing one thing at a time. He brought up potatoes from the cellar in a 10-gallon galvanized bucket and boiled them on the stove and served them with salt and with butter from the small block he had in the icebox. He brought up carrots and chopped them and added them to the pot. He brought up onions. He brought up 2 jars of tomatoes and poured them in. He did not call the meal a meal. He called it, in his own head, fuel, because calling it anything else would have made him think about how much of it there was going to need to be. He brought up the 24-roll pack of toilet paper he had bought in August for reasons he had not been able to explain to himself at the time. He brought up a case of bottled water. He brought up the 2 extra wool blankets he had stored on a high shelf in the cellar in a cedar chest. He brought up a box of candles and a second oil lantern. He brought up from the back of a bottom shelf an unopened jar of peach preserves, and he set it on the table in front of the Hutterite children, who looked at their mother first, and then at the jar, and then at their mother again, and who did not open it until their mother nodded. Elena worked beside him without being asked. She did not hesitate. She did not defer. She moved through the kitchen the way a person moves through a kitchen they have run before, and she picked up tasks before he named them, and within an hour she and Mrs. Oleson had set up a small informal station at the counter where hot tea was produced on a steady rotation and passed in cups to the newest arrivals first. Mateo sat in the kitchen chair by the stove with Smokey's head across his wool-socked feet, and he did not speak, and he did not move. He had eaten 3 bites of a boiled potato and had stopped. He held the chain at his throat with his small hand. He watched the door. Around 2 in the afternoon, Carl Hensley arrived. He came in a soaked barn coat with the store's name stitched above the breast pocket, his boots leaving brown water across the floor, his face flushed with the particular shame of a loud man who has just watched his own storefront go under. He stood in the doorway and took off his cap and held it in both hands. "Jacks," he said. "Carl, come in. Shut the door." "I didn't." "Shut the door, Carl." Carl shut the door. He looked around the cabin. He counted, without meaning to count, the 17 faces turned toward him. He looked at the kettle on the stove. He looked at the bowl of boiled potatoes on the table. He looked at Elena standing at the counter with her hands around a cup of tea she was about to hand to a neighbor she had never formally met. He looked at the dog on the floor with her head across a small boy's feet. He looked at Jacks. His mouth worked once. No words came. "There's tea," Jacks said. "There's food. Sit down, Carl. It's all right." Carl sat down. He sat at the kitchen table in the one remaining chair, and he set his cap on the table in front of him, and he put his face in his hands for a count of perhaps 7 seconds, and then he took his face out of his hands and looked at the wall. "The store's gone," he said quietly. "The whole back. All of it." "I know," Jacks said. "I never—" Carl did not finish the sentence. Jacks did not press him. He set a cup of tea in front of Carl, and he set a bowl of boiled potato in front of him, and he said, "Eat something. You'll feel better." Carl ate. He ate slow. He did not look at Jacks while he ate. The rain outside was a solid, unbroken wall of sound against the tin roof. At 3 in the afternoon, the generator began to miss. It had been running for 11 hours, well past its comfortable duty cycle. Jacks went out in the rain with a flashlight and topped it off from the reserve can in the shed. He checked the oil. He tapped the fuel filter. He coaxed it back to a steady idle. He came back inside. At 3:45, the younger of the Peterson boys, the 5-year-old, began to cry. It was not a loud cry. It was a tired, broken, involuntary cry. The cry of a child who had held up for 12 hours and was out of capacity. His mother lifted him onto her lap and rocked him against her shoulder and hummed something old under her breath, and the crying slowly eased. The sound of it reached Jax across the room. He was standing at the stove with a long wooden spoon in one hand. He had been stirring a new pot of carrots. He became aware of the spoon in his hand the way a man becomes aware of an object that has just become heavier than it was a second ago. The sound of the child crying, muffled against the mother's shoulder, was a sound he had heard before, in another country. And that other country did not stay where it was supposed to stay. The sound came forward. The rain on the tin roof came forward with it. The two sounds layered themselves, the way they had layered themselves sometimes in other places, and for a long second the cabin was not the cabin. He was in an armored vehicle at night in a country he did not want to be in, and the rain was hammering the hull above his head, a rain that had come after 40 days of dust, and that had made everything worse, and a child was crying somewhere in the back of the vehicle, in the dark. A child whose name he had not known and whose family they had been evacuating, and beside him in the dark was the voice of Corporal Luis Marquez saying a prayer under his breath in Spanish. The cabin came back. It came back in pieces, the wooden spoon in his hand, the weight of the flannel shirt across his back, the soft regular drip of a coat sleeve leaking onto the plank floor by the door, the sight of his own hand, the scarred one, white at the knuckles where he was gripping the spoon. Smokey was at his knee. She had crossed the cabin without a sound. She had left Mateo's feet, and the boy's feet had not come off of her back, because the boy had been asleep, finally his head against the arm of the chair, and she had stood and moved without waking him. And she had come to Jax's knee, because she had heard the thing he could not hear, and had smelled the thing he could not smell, and had known before his own mind had known that he was about to step out of the room. She leaned her full weight against his left thigh. It was an anchoring pressure. It was a pressure they had negotiated, the two of them, over 1,000 small moments in the 4 years since her retirement, in motel rooms, and in the cab of the truck, and on the porch of the cabin in thunderstorms, and in the parking lot of VA clinics, and once, in the aisle of a grocery store in Missoula, when the fluorescent lights had done something his eyes did not like. She leaned, and she stayed leaned, and she did not whine, and she did not bark, and her head tilted up and her amber eyes fixed on his face and held there. 4 in through the nose, 7 holding 8 out through the mouth. He did it once, he did it twice, he did it 3 times. The spoon eased in his hand. The knuckles went from white to pink. The sound of the rain on the roof became the sound of the rain on the roof. The child in the other room was still crying, softly, but the crying was a child's crying, not the other crying. He looked down. Smokey's eyes had not moved off of him. "I'm here," he said very quietly, in the voice only she could hear. "I'm here, girl." Her tail thumped once, slowly, against the plank floor. He set the spoon on the counter. He walked slowly across the kitchen. He stopped at the chair where Mateo was sleeping, with his small flushed cheek against the chair arm and his small hand still wrapped around the chain at his throat. Jax did not sit. He stood there. He looked at the boy. He looked at the chain. He did not yet look at what was on the chain. Elena was watching him from the counter. She had seen something. She had seen the pressure of the dog against his thigh and the stilling of his body afterward, and she was watching him with the quiet, practiced eye of a woman who had lived for 3 years in a house where a man she had loved sometimes left the room without leaving the room. And she did not say anything, and she did not look away, and when Jax met her eyes across the kitchen, he understood, in a flat and dispassionate way, that she had recognized what she had seen. He nodded at her. Once, she nodded back. Nothing else passed between them. It did not need to. He stepped out onto the porch. He closed the door behind him quietly so as not to wake the boy, and he stood in the narrow dry strip under the overhang, and he looked at the wall of rain coming down off the edge of the roof. His hands were shaking slightly at the cuffs of the flannel. He put them into the pockets of the field jacket he had thrown on over it. The thought he did not want to have came anyway. It came in the form of a question. It came in the voice of a part of him he had not silenced in 14 months on this land, and that part of him said, very clearly, "You do not have to stay. You can walk out to the truck will start. You can drive up the county road as far as you can drive, and you can walk the rest. You owe these people nothing. You owe this town nothing. You warned no one, because no one asked you to warn them. You are not a first responder, you are not the sheriff. You are a man with a cabin full of strangers who would have mocked you yesterday and will mock you again the minute the rain stops, and you do not have to stand here and carry them." He stood there a long time. Smokey came out through the door behind him. She pushed it open with her nose the way she had learned to push open doors in 3 languages, and she came to his left side, and she sat. She sat very straight. Her ears were forward, her eyes were on the edge of the porch where the water streamed down. The question ran itself out. It took perhaps a minute. It always took about a minute. On the other side of the minute was the other part of him, the older part, the part that was not a man thinking about himself but a sergeant thinking about a situation, and that part of him said simply, "There are 17 people in there, and one of them is a 5-year-old boy, and one of them is an 80-year-old woman. And one of them is a child wearing a dead soldier's dog tags, and the food in your cellar is the only food in the valley tonight, and you are the only man on this side of the mussel shell who is standing up." He looked down at Smokey. She looked up at him. "Yeah," he said. "All right." He went back inside. The door clicked shut behind him. The room was warm and smelled of boiled potatoes and wet wool and wood smoke, and 17 faces did not turn to look at him when he came back in, because none of them knew he had stepped out, and none of them needed to know. Elena knew. She caught his eye once across the kitchen, and she nodded once, and she turned back to the kettle. He picked up the spoon, he stirred the carrots, the rain kept coming. By late afternoon on the 4th day the rain had not stopped, but it had changed. It had gone from the steady driving sheet of the first 3 days to a finer, softer, colder rain, the kind that did not hammer, but instead settled. A slow gray curtain draped over the valley from ridge to ridge. The creek had stopped rising. It had held at its highest mark, a mark that put the Dahlgren farmhouse under 5 feet of water and had taken everything in the valley that could be taken, and now, somewhere beneath the surface, the slow patient work of the water beginning to consider receding had begun. Inside the cabin, 17 people had become 21. 3 more had arrived during the afternoon, the Blazingame family from the Ridge Road, and they had brought with them a small dairy goat they had refused to leave in their collapsing barn. The goat was tied to the porch rail under the overhang, a small brown and white animal with wet fur and tired eyes, and one of the Peterson boys had brought it a bowl of water and was now sitting on the porch beside it, scratching the soft place between its horn buds, talking to it in the particular low murmur a child uses when he is the only one a thing has. The cabin had settled into a kind of rhythm. There was a station at the stove where Mrs. Oleson and Mrs. Hanson now ran a nearly continuous rotation of hot tea and broth, using the jarred tomatoes from the cellar and whatever dried herbs Jax had. There was a station at the kitchen table where Elena had organized the distribution of dry clothes and blankets, assigning items by size and need with a quiet authority that no one questioned and several people had come to lean on. There was a station in the living room where Caleb Turner and Ben Oleson had rolled out the braided rag rug to cover more floor and laid down the cabin's entire supply of wool blankets in a long, flat bed where the smaller children could sleep. There was a station at the door where Jax himself stood for most of each hour watching the weather, watching the road, watching the 3 sections of horizon he had learned over 14 months to read for their specific lies. Carl Hensley, of all people, had taken over the generator. He had come up beside Jax around 4 in the afternoon and had said, without looking at him, "I can run a generator," and Jax had nodded once and had said, "It needs topping off every 4 hours, oil check every 8, and the fuel filter's been crying since noon," and Carl had said, "I heard it," and had gone out into the rain and had not come back except to refill the fuel can, and the generator had steadied into a low, even idle that it had not produced all day. Jax had watched this from the window without comment. He had understood what it meant. A man who has nothing left sometimes needs a thing to run, and the running of it is the thing that keeps him upright, and a good sergeant knows better than to say so out loud. The light began to go out of the sky at 6:30. The valley had no electricity. The only light in the cabin was the amber burn of 2 oil lanterns and the half-orange flicker of the stove through the grate. The lanterns had been trimmed low to stretch the oil. The stove was on half-damp. The room was warm. Warmer than it had any right to be with 21 people in it. Warm with the animal heat of bodies pressed together in small clusters under blankets. The smell of the cabin had become a layered, complex thing. Wood smoke first, then boiled vegetable, then wet wool, then threading through all of it, The cedar of the cabin walls, and the oil of the lanterns, and the faint sweet green tang of the potatoes that Jax had brought up in a fresh bucket an hour ago. Mateo had not spoken in 4 days. He had eaten, he had drunk. He had used the small outhouse out back when Jax had walked him to it and had walked him back. He had slept, some in the chair by the stove with Smokey's head across his feet. He had held the chain at his throat through most of it, but he had not made a sound that could be called a word. And Elena, without drawing attention to it, had stopped trying to draw one out of him. She had come up beside Jax at the door around 5 and had said quietly, "He did this before, after his father. For 6 weeks. Then it came back. He'll come back." Jax had looked at her. He had not asked. She had not said more. He had nodded once, and she had turned back to her station at the table, and he had kept watch at the door. Now, in the deepening gray of the end of the 4th day, Jax sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded around a cup of tea he had not drunk, and watched the room. Elena was refolding a blanket at the counter. Mrs. Oleson was humming under her breath as she wiped the rim of a tea kettle with a dish towel. The Hutterite father had taken his children up to the loft, where Jax had set out a fresh stack of blankets, and their small voices drifted down through the ceiling in the low murmur of prayers in German that Jax did not understand and did not need to. Carl Hensley was back in the main room now, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, a blanket across his knees, his eyes half closed. Ben Oleson was asleep beside his mother's chair. The 2 Vance sisters had both finally slept, their gray heads leaned against each other in the corner. Caleb Turner was standing at the window, staring out at the rain. Mateo was sitting on an overturned crate near the stove. He had gotten up from the chair sometime in the last 20 minutes, slowly, carefully, so as not to wake Smokey, and had crossed the 3 feet of plank floor to the overturned crate, where he had sat with his back to the cabin wall. He was small. He was smaller than any child in the room. His wool socks came up over his knees. He was wearing one of Jax's old flannel shirts with the sleeves rolled up, and a pair of sweatpants that had been cinched at the waist with a piece of clothesline because nothing in the cabin had fit him. He was holding the chain at his throat with both hands, his small fingers wrapped around the beaded line of it, his eyes fixed on nothing. Smokey had gotten up when he had gotten up. She had done it without sound. She had risen from the braided rag rug and had taken 4 slow steps across the floor and had stopped perhaps 6 feet from the crate. She had stood there a long moment. She had lowered her nose to the floor and lifted it. She had turned her head toward Jax at the table. Once, briefly, the way she had sometimes turned her head toward him in other rooms in other countries when she was telling him something she could not tell him out loud. Then she had turned her head back toward the boy. Jax had set his tea down. He had not known in any conscious way what she was about to do. He had only known, with the old unworded clarity of a man who had spent 4 years reading her body in the precise conditions under which a life depended on reading her body, that she was about to do something. She walked toward the boy. She walked slowly. She walked the way she had walked toward him across the kitchen of the cabin that first morning, 14 months ago, with that careful sweeping deliberation that was not fear but assessment, and she stopped 2 feet in front of the crate, and she sat. She sat with her front paws perfectly even, her back was straight, her ears were forward. Her amber eyes were fixed on the boy's face with the steady, unblinking intelligence that had once been used to find men in caves and that now, in a cabin in a flooded Montana valley, was being used for something else. The boy did not look up at her at first. He was looking at the floor. His small hands were still wrapped around the chain. Smokey lowered her head. She lowered it until her nose was perhaps 4 inches from the boy's small wrists. She held it there, her nostrils flared, once, twice, in the slow, deliberate breathing of a scent-trained dog who is taking in information. The boy, without moving, without lifting his head, opened his hands. The dog tags fell forward on the chain. They caught the lantern light. They hung, 2 flat rectangles of stamped aluminum, the second one cushioned by a black silicone ring on a short beaded chain that ended in a smaller clip. They had been worn by the boy for a long time. The edges were rounded from handling. The engraving was shallow but still readable in the amber light. Smokey lowered her nose the remaining 4 inches. She put her nose to the tags. She breathed in. She did this for perhaps 3 full seconds. She was not licking them. She was not mouthing them. She was reading them, in the only language she had, which was the language of her nose, and the language of her nose was an instrument. Jax had once seen detect a single grain of a specific compound in a room the size of a warehouse. Then she lowered her head. She lowered it the rest of the way down. The great noble skull of her, the heavy jaw, the amber eyes, all of it, and she laid her head across the boy's lap. She did not move. The boy sat very still. The boy's small hands rose slowly, one and then the other, and settled in the thick double coat on the back of Smokey's neck. His fingers spread in the fur. He did not look at her face. He did not say anything. He did not move otherwise. He only sat, his small hands in her coat, his eyes fixed on some point inside himself, while the dog's head lay heavy and steady and warm across his small thighs. The room had gone quiet. Jax did not know when it had gone quiet. He did not know which person in the room had fallen silent first. He did not know who had looked up from what they were doing and seen, and who had then, without a word, laid a hand on the arm of the person beside them and drawn their attention to it. He only knew that the room, which had held the low rolling murmur of 21 people breathing and whispering and shifting for 4 solid days, had stopped making any sound at all, and that the loudest thing in the cabin, now, was the soft tick of the rain on the tin roof and the low even breathing of a dog who had laid her head on a boy's lap and had decided, apparently, not to lift it again for a while. Elena was at the counter. She had stopped folding the blanket. She was looking at her son and the dog, and her hands had gone very still on the cloth, and Jax could see from where he sat that she had stopped breathing. He stood up. He stood slowly. He did not want to make any motion that would disturb the tableau at the stove. He walked around the table quietly, the way he had walked through bedrooms of sleeping children on 3 continents in the practice of a job that had required him sometimes to walk through bedrooms of sleeping children. And he came to a stop behind Mateo, and he looked down. He saw the chain around the boy's neck. He saw the first tag hanging forward on the beaded line. He saw the engraving. The name on the tag read Marquez. The line below it read Louis E. The line below that was the service number and the blood type. The line below that was the next of kin code he had never in his life memorized. The last line was USMC. He did not move. He did not speak. He stood a long time looking at the tag, and the tag did not change, and the name did not change, and the service number did not change, and the room around him did not change, and the dog did not lift her head, and the boy did not lift his hand, and the rain outside did not stop. He felt his own face change, very slightly, the way the face of a man changes when something inside him that has been locked for a long time turns over in its lock and begins to open. He felt his right hand, the scarred one at his side, go cold. He felt the beat of his own heart in the hollow of his throat, slow and heavy. He felt the weight of 14 months of shovels and timbers and cedar walls, and the smell of turned earth rearrange itself, quietly, inside him, into a shape he had not known it had. He closed his eyes. He did not close them for more than a second. He opened them. He stepped back, once, very quietly, so as not to disturb the boy or the dog, and he turned, and he looked at Elena. She was looking at him. She had, over the course of the last 30 seconds, while he had been reading the tag, understood that he was reading the tag, and she had, over the course of the same 30 seconds, watched his face change, and she had, in the last 3 of those seconds, begun to understand what the change on his face meant. She had set the blanket down on the counter. Her hand was flat on the cloth. Her knuckles were white. He walked slowly across the kitchen. Around him, the room was still silent. Mrs. Oleson had turned toward the stove, though not to tend it. She had turned to face away from what was happening at the crate, and she had put her hand on Ben's shoulder where he slept, and she was looking at the wall. Carl Hensley had opened his eyes from the wall. He had understood in the particular slow way a man like Carl Hensley understands a thing he has never had words for, that something was happening in the room that was not for him to witness, and he had turned his head carefully toward the floor. Caleb Turner at the window had not turned. He had kept his back to the room. He had not moved a muscle. One by one, without anyone speaking, without anyone signaling, the adults in the cabin had turned their faces away. The way adults in certain rooms turn their faces away when the thing in front of them is not theirs. Jax stopped in front of Elena. He did not know what his face looked like. He did not care. "I knew him," he said. His voice was very low. It was pitched so that only she could hear it. She did not answer. Her eyes had filled. "I was his squad leader," he said. He did not say more. He did not need to say more. He watched her face as the fact settled into it, and he watched the fact do the thing to her that he had known it would do, and he watched her hand rise from the cloth on the counter and go to her mouth, and he watched her eyes close, and he watched the first tear slip out from under the closed eyelid and track down her cheek in a line that reflected the lantern light the color of honey. He did not touch her. He did not move. He did not know whether touching her would be a kindness or an unbearable offense. And in his uncertainty he did the only thing he was certain of, which was to stand where he was, in front of her, at the distance of 2 feet, with his hands at his sides, and to let her see him. She opened her eyes. She looked at him. She did not speak for a long time. "I knew," she said finally. Her voice was very soft. It was almost a whisper. "I knew from the first time I saw you at the store, the way you held yourself, the way you looked at Mateo, the dog. I knew. Some part of me knew. I didn't let myself know." He did not answer. "Was it quick?" she said. He looked at her. He knew the question. It was a question he had been asked before. In other cabins, in other states, by other family members of other men, he had been unable to bring home, and he had learned that the honest answer and the bearable answer were not always the same answer. And he had learned that a widow deserved the honest one if she had asked for it. "Yes," he said, "it was very quick. He didn't see it coming. He wasn't afraid at the end. He was with me. He was with his people." Her face broke. It broke quietly. She put both hands over her face, and she stood at the counter in the oversized flannel shirt of a man she had never met until 4 days ago, and she wept in a way that did not make any sound, her shoulders shaking in small hard tremors that she was trying to contain and that would not stay contained. He did not move. He stood in front of her. He put his right hand, the scarred one, flat on the counter beside her, palm down, and he left it there. It was all the touch he could offer. She could take it or not take it. She did not take it at first. Then, after perhaps half a minute, she lowered her right hand from her face and laid it on top of his, and she kept it there. Across the kitchen, at the overturned crate by the stove, Smokey had not lifted her head. The boy's small hand was still in her coat. His other hand had come up slowly and found the first hand. He was holding her. He was holding her the way a drowning person holds a rope, with his full small weight pressed forward now. His forehead against the top of her head between her ears, his face pressed into the deep fur behind her skull. He had not made a sound, but his small shoulders had begun to shake once and again, and Jax understood across the distance of the kitchen that the boy who had not made a word in 4 days was crying silently into the neck of a dog who had served with his father in a country he would never see. After a long time the boy lifted his head. His small face was wet. His eyes were red. He did not look up at his mother. He did not look up at Jax. He looked at Smokey. He looked at her the way a child looks at something he has been waiting for 3 years, without knowing what he was waiting for. "Hi," he said. It was his first word in 4 days, and it was not for his mother, and it was not for Jax, and it was not for any human being in the room. It was for the dog, Smokey's tail, which had lain perfectly still against the plank floor for the duration of her stillness, thumped once, softly, in answer. The boy put his small arms around her neck. He pressed his face back into her coat. He did not say anything else. At the counter, Jax felt Elena's hand tighten on top of his. In the corner, Caleb Turner at the window had begun to cry as well. Silently, without turning, his shoulders shaking under his wet barn coat. Carl Hensley, on the floor with his back against the wall, had put his hand over his eyes. Mrs. Oleson was still turned toward the stove. She did not move. The rain tapped the tin roof of the cabin in its slow, even rhythm, and outside, in the last of the gray light, the water in the valley stood motionless at its highest mark, and somewhere under the surface of that water, a slow, patient receding had begun. They talked in the small back room. It was the only room in the cabin with a door that closed, and it was the room where Jack slept. And it was furnished with a bed and a wooden chair and a small writing desk his uncle had built in 1962. And on the wall above the desk was a single-framed photograph of a river in sunlight that Denton Harlan had taken in 1974 and had written the date and the river's name on the back of in pencil. Jax had left the photograph where he had found it. Elena sat in the chair. Jax sat on the edge of the bed. Mateo had fallen asleep on the braided rag rug out in the main room, with his small arms still around Smokey, and Smokey had curled her body in a half-circle around him and had closed her eyes, and Mrs. Oleson had draped a wool blanket over them both, quietly. and had returned to her station at the stove, and the adults in the cabin had continued to move through the soft business of the evening without comment on what had happened, because some things a community does not comment on until the morning after. And then only in the small, steady ways that community comment is allowed to take. In the back room, Jax told her. He told her the part about Luis that she needed to hear first, which was the part about the kind of soldier Luis had been. He told her about the quiet steadiness of him. He told her about the way Luis had made coffee in the mornings, for the men in the squad, every morning for 11 months, because Luis had grown up in a house where coffee in the morning had been an act of love, and he had not lost that through any part of the deployment. He told her about the photograph of her and of the boy Luis had kept in the inside pocket of his plate carrier, laminated, the edges of the plastic worn soft from the handling of a man's fingers in a dark vehicle at 4 in the morning. He told her that when the squad had lost its first man, 8 months in, Luis had stayed up all night with the man's best friend and had listened to him talk for 6 hours straight, and had not said much, and had been what the man had needed. He told her these things first, because these were the things she needed to have, and because he knew that in the weight of what was coming, she would not remember them if he told them to her after. Then he told her the other part. He told her about the ambush. He told her about the terrain. He told her about the road, the narrow road with the walls of the wadi on either side. The road that an intelligence report had cleared 6 hours earlier, and that should not have been a road where an ambush could happen. He told her about the first IED, which had come from the front of the convoy, and the second, which had come from the rear, and the way the two of them had closed them in. He told her about the small arms fire from the high ground on both sides, the specific rate of it, the specific direction. He told her about the decisions he had made in the first 40 seconds. He told her about the decision he had made in the second 40 seconds. He told her where Luis had been when the second IED went off. He did not spare himself. He did not lay the decisions off onto the situation, or onto the intelligence, or onto the enemy. He told her flatly that he had been the squad leader and that the decisions had been his to make, and that he had made them as well as he knew how, and that one of the decisions had been wrong, and that Luis had been the cost of that wrong decision, and that he had carried that cost every single day since. She listened without interrupting. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face did not change. She did not cry. She had done the crying at the counter. When he was done, she said, "Did you get the others out?" "4 of the 6, he said. "Where's the 6th? "Adrian Kowalski. He lost both legs. He lives in a VA facility in Montana City. I drive down once a month. And Luis, I brought him home. I carried him to the medevac myself. I did not let anyone else carry him." She closed her eyes. She sat with them closed for a long time. He watched her face. He saw the small muscles at the corners of her jaw working. He saw the flat line of her mouth hold itself steady. When she opened her eyes, she said, "Thank you for telling me." He did not answer. "He wrote me about you," she said. "He didn't use your name. He was careful about names. He wrote me about a sergeant who he said was the reason he was going to come home. He said, 'This man has kept me alive twice.' He said, 'I have followed this man into rooms I would not have walked into alone.' He said, 'If I come home, it will be because of him.'" Jax felt the muscles of his throat work. He did not speak. "You did keep him alive twice," she said. "You kept him alive twice that I know of, and probably 6 times I don't. You did what you could do the 3rd time. The decision was wrong. As you say, the decision was wrong. I will not tell you it was not. I loved my husband. I will tell you I am angry. I am angry at you. I have been angry at a man I did not know the name of for 3 years. I was angry at the army. I was angry at the country. I was angry at a line on a map in a place I couldn't point to on a globe. I was angry at the decision. Now I have a face to put to it. Now I can be angry at the face. That is a thing I have needed for 3 years and did not know I needed." He nodded. "Once. But," she said, and her voice shifted, "you are also the man who came through a flood to get my son and me off of a roof. You are also the man who has fed 21 people out of a hole in a hill for 4 days. You are also the man who built that hole in the hill over the course of a summer, while your neighbors laughed at you and did not stop to ask why. You are also the man whose dog just laid her head on my son's lap and brought back a word I have not heard him say in a year." She paused. She breathed in. She let it out. "I can be angry at you for one thing and grateful to you for another," she said. "I can hold both. I have held both before. Luis used to say, a person is more than one thing at a time, and you have to be strong enough to hold all of them at once, or you will lose them. I lost him. I'm not going to lose the rest of the people in my life that way. She stood. She walked across the small room and sat down beside him on the edge of the bed. She did not touch him. She looked at the photograph of the river on the wall above the desk. I'm going to need some time, she said. Take it. I'm going to come back and tell you more. Later, what I am feeling now is not the last thing I will feel. I'm going to need to ask you things over the next year that you're not going to want to answer. I'm going to need you to answer them anyway. Can you do that? Yes. Matteo does not need to know the details. Not yet. Not for a long time. No. He needs to know you knew his father. He needs to know his father was a good soldier and that you were the man beside him. That is what he needs to know now. Yes. The rest is for me. The rest is for later. Yes. All right. She sat a moment longer. Then she reached over without looking at him and laid her hand on his scarred one, where it rested on the quilt of the bed, the way she had laid her hand on it at the kitchen counter an hour ago. She did not speak. He did not speak. They sat in the small room in the lantern light for perhaps 2 minutes, her hand on his hand, neither of them crying, neither of them moving, and then she stood, and she walked to the door and she opened it. And she went out into the main room where her son was sleeping against the body of a dog who had served with the boy's father, and she closed the door softly behind her. Jack sat on the edge of the bed a long time, he did not know for how long. He listened to the low murmur of the cabin through the door, the quiet voices of the adults at the stove, the occasional shift of a sleeping child on the blankets, the small even breath of a dog. He listened to the rain, which had softened further and which was now barely more than a mist against the tin roof. He looked at the photograph of the river on the wall above the desk. He looked at the date in his uncle's handwriting. He looked at the river. He stood. He went out into the main room. He did not draw attention to himself. He sat in the kitchen chair that had been his place for 4 days. He picked up the cup of tea he had set down an hour ago. It was cold. He drank it anyway. Across the room, at the foot of the rag rug, Smokey opened one eye without lifting her head. She watched him for a long second. Then she closed the eye again and settled deeper against the small warm body of the sleeping boy. The rain went out somewhere around 3 in the morning. It did not stop in any dramatic way. It simply thinned and eventually failed, the way a voice fails when the person speaking has run out of the thing they were saying, and the cabin filled with the new silence of a world that had been roaring for 4 days and was finally not roaring, and in that silence the exhausted people inside slept more deeply than they had slept in a week. And Jax Harlan, at the kitchen table, with his hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea and his eyes on the sleeping boy and the sleeping dog, slept too, for the first time in more than 90 hours, with his head laid down on his folded forearms on the plank surface of the table, and he did not dream of anything at all. The first helicopter came over the ridge at 10:15 the next morning. It was a National Guard Black Hawk out of Helena, and it came in low over the eastern slope with its rotor wash flattening the already flattened grass, and behind it, at altitude, were 3 more. The valley below them was a long, narrow lake, reflecting the first true sun anyone had seen in 5 days, and around the edges of the lake, on the higher ground, small columns of wood smoke rose from 17 places the pilots had been briefed to expect. Jack stood on the porch with Smokey at his knee and watched them come in. Ben Olesen stood beside him. Elena stood in the doorway behind him with Matteo half asleep against her hip, his small hand still holding the chain at his throat, his other small hand resting against the top of Smokey's skull between her ears. The lead helicopter circled once, reading the ground, and set down in the flat pasture above Jax's cabin, and 2 medics and a staff sergeant jumped out before the skids had fully settled, and they came up the hill at a jog. What happened after that took 9 hours and involved a lot of paperwork. The medics went through the cabin bed by bed. The staff sergeant, a young woman named Coltrane, who had done 2 tours in Afghanistan and who recognized in Jax what her father had been, gave him a nod that did not need any words around it. The helicopters began ferrying the elderly and the children to the evacuation center in Roundup. The Vance sisters went first. Mrs. Olesen refused to go without her son, and Ben refused to go at all, and the medics allowed both of them to stay. The Hutterite family was reunited with extended kin at the evacuation center by the end of the afternoon. The Blazing Games went up in the 3rd shift with their goat, which the medics, after some discussion, permitted to fly. Elena and Matteo did not go on the helicopters. Jax asked her. She looked at him. She said quietly, "I would rather stay here, if you'll have us. Until the water is down enough to walk to my place." He nodded. She did not say more. The rest of what happened over the next 2 weeks is not the important part of the story. The water came down, the helicopters came and went. The Red Cross set up a field station in the church parking lot in Creek Bend. Insurance adjusters began to arrive, one by one, in small white cars with clipboards. The FEMA teams, when they finally came, were professional and tired and overworked and did their best. The roads were cleared one by county crews with chainsaws. The Dahlgren farmhouse was declared a total loss. The store was declared a total loss. 3 barns, 2 hay sheds, and a bridge were declared total losses. No human beings in Creekbend Valley were declared a total loss, which was a sentence Jax heard a FEMA worker use at a public meeting and which he thought about, later, for a long time, without deciding whether he liked it or not. The town meeting happened on the 9th day after the waters began to recede. It was held in the Lutheran church because the Methodist church had taken water in the basement and the school gymnasium's floor was warped. 214 people came, almost everyone in the valley. Jax sat in the back row with Smokey at his knee. Elena sat beside him. Mateo was across the aisle with the younger Peterson boy, who he had begun, over the course of the last week, to talk to in small, quiet exchanges that involved a great deal of pointing at things and not many words. The meeting went through its agenda, which was long when it came to the portion called New Business. Carl Hensley stood up from the third pew on the right side. Carl was a changed man. He had not become a different man. He was the same man, but he was quieter than he had been, and he moved more carefully, and when he spoke at the pew, he did not boom the way he had always boomed. "I want to say something," Carl said. The room looked at him. "I made some jokes about Jax Harlan's cellar this summer. I made them in my store. I made them loud. I made them many times. I am not going to pretend I did not. Some of you were there. You heard them. There are 21 people in this room tonight who ate out of that cellar for 4 days. I was one of them. My sister's family was one of them. I made those jokes, and I ate those potatoes, and I am a man who is going to live with that for the rest of his life." He paused. "I don't know what I'm asking for here. I don't know if I'm asking for anything. I am just saying it because it needs to be said. Jax, you fed this town. You fed it out of your own pocket. You fed it out of work you did on your own time with your own hands. You did not charge us. You did not crow about it. You did not have to open that door to us. You did. I am telling you publicly in this church, in front of our neighbors, that I am sorry. I am telling you I was wrong. I am telling you I will not forget it." He sat down. The church was silent. Jax did not stand. He did not speak. He nodded once, slowly from the back row. Carl across the room saw the nod. Carl nodded back. The pastor, a small gray-haired woman named Reverend Trask, cleared her throat and moved to the next item on the agenda, which was the rebuilding committee. On the way out of the church, Reverend Trask stopped Jax in the vestibule. She was a tiny woman, perhaps 5'1", and she put her small hand on the sleeve of his jacket and said softly, "My husband came home from Korea in 1954. He did not sleep for most of the following year. I want you to know that I saw you. I saw you when you moved in. I have prayed for you every week for 14 months. I am going to keep doing it." He looked down at her. He swallowed twice. He said, "Thank you, ma'am." "Thank you," she said. "Thank you, son." She patted his sleeve once and let him go. Outside, on the steps of the church, Elena was waiting for him with Mateo's hand in hers. The boy looked up at him. The boy opened his mouth and closed it. The boy opened it again. "Mr. Harlan," Mateo said. It was the first time the boy had ever addressed him directly. "Can Smokey come live at our house too sometimes?" Jax crouched down. He looked the boy in the eye. He did not answer immediately. He looked over at Elena, and Elena nodded once. "If it's all right with your mother," Jax said, "then yes, she can come visit any time." "Okay," the boy said. And then, after a moment, while the adults around them were beginning to file out of the church and into the evening light of a Montana valley that had just begun to dry, the boy stepped forward, and he put his small arms around Jax's neck, and he hugged him, once, hard, the way a child hugs when the child has decided that a thing can be done, and then he stepped back, and he took his mother's hand, and he walked down the steps. Jax stayed crouched for a moment longer. He put his hand, the scarred one, on Smokey's back. Smokey turned her head and looked at him. He stood. He followed Elena and the boy down the steps, into the last long light of the October sun. First snow came to Creekbend Valley on the third Thursday of December. It came lightly, a slow sifting of dry flakes out of a gray afternoon sky, dusting the porch rails and the woodpile and the tin roof of the cellar door on the hillside. Jax was splitting cedar behind the cabin when it started. He set the maul down, pulled off his gloves and watched it come. Through the kitchen window, he could see Elena at the table with a mug in her hands, writing something in a composition notebook she had begun keeping in October. On the rag rug at her feet, Mateo was on his stomach with a set of wooden blocks, building a structure that Jax had watched grow for 3 days without asking what it was. Smokey lay beside the boy with her chin across his ankle. Elena looked up. She saw Jax through the glass. She held up the mug in a small gesture. "Come in." He walked to the porch. He stacked the split cedar under the overhang. He stamped the snow off his boots. He came inside. She had poured him coffee. She set it across the table from her. He sat. He wrapped his scarred hand around the mug. The steam rose. "Thank you," he said. It was a small thing. It was a thing he had not for 14 months been able to say without something inside him closing. He said it now. She nodded without looking up from the notebook. Smokey thumped her tail once against the plank floor. Outside, the snow settled onto the cedar door halfway up the hillside, and behind that door, in the lantern-lit cold, the shelves stood full, and in the kitchen a boy laid one block carefully on top of another, and a man and a woman sat across from each other in the quiet. And the work that no one had understood had been all along the work that had brought them here. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.